Everyday Samurai, Ep07. Greetings, friends, and welcome to Everyday Samurai, in service to your liberty and the security of a free state. If you've been studying any form of martial art for a length of time, chances are you've come across Sun Tzu's The Art of War, or what is known in Japanese as Sun Tzu. There are a number of translations available out there, and I think I've read about 7 different versions. Right now, my go-to translation is at sunshi.com. They are very proud to state that theirs is a consummate translation backed by reputable scholars with a meticulous rendering from the original Chinese. I happen to like it, and it's very convenient to get the full translated book right there on their site. In any case, you'll notice that supplies are a consistent theme that keeps popping up in The Art of War. For instance, in Chapter 7 on maneuver, Sun Tzu writes, "An army without its baggage train is lost. Without provisions, it is lost. Without bases of supply, it is lost." We know that supplies, and when coupled with the means of transportation, otherwise known as the baggage train, is called logistics in the modern sense. Sun Tzu spends a great deal of time discussing this, even in the first chapter where calculations are made in the temple to determine who has the advantage. At least according to the translation on sunshi.com, one of the factors to consider is called law, and it is defined as organization, the chain of command, logistics, and the control of expenses. So, law, according to Sun Tzu, is how well ordered, organized, and provisioned the fighting force is relative to the task at hand. The skillful use of resources, always keeping in mind the citizenry from which battle preparations are extracted, is an essential task for a general that contributes to the good of a nation. Sun Tzu goes on to state that it is important to get on with the job, execute quickly, and accomplish the mission. From this, we see passages like, "If the army is involved in a long campaign, the nation's resources will not suffice," or "No nation has ever benefited from protracted warfare." And also, "Those skilled in doing battle do not raise troops twice or transport provisions 3 times." The impact supplying a military has on the people of a nation stays foremost to Sun Tzu. He relays the suffering imposed merely by a military's demand for resources. Those in proximity to the army will sell goods at high prices. When goods are expensive, the citizens' wealth will be exhausted. When their wealth is exhausted, the peasantry will be afflicted with increased taxes. This reminds me of the concept I first heard from the economist Robert Higgs, who said something to the effect that before a nation can go to war with another nation, it must first go to war with its own people. This is true foremost in regard to the demand for resources as well as goods, human labor, and the services they provide. It's interesting to see these maxims illustrated by a thinker writing over 2,500 years ago. There are quite a few lessons in political economy to be found there. It's for this reason, I think, that Sun Tzu kept returning to ideas like doing lots of cost-to-benefit calculation prior to doing battle, and stressed the need to keep things intact rather than engaging in destructive and expensive warfare. War is, by its nature, inefficient, and minimizing the destruction and resource depletion involved in conflict is paramount to sound leadership. That is, if the leader is to be considered a real defender of the people and guardian of the nation. There's an adage that young warriors want to talk about tactics, while more experienced warriors always discuss logistics. We can look at 2 historical examples of logistics overcoming tactics or moral factors in war. The first is in the case of Spartans versus the Greeks. Everyone lauds the Spartans as terrific fighters and having an entire society organized for war. There's lots of fame surrounding the story of their sacrifice, the 300 Spartans holding off the Persians at the Battle of Thermopylae. Most people forget is, first, just how important the Greek navy was to holding back the full onslaught of Persian forces, such that the Spartans could hold them as long as they did in that narrow mountain pass. The second and most important part of Spartan lore to remember is that the country was economically backward, with prohibitions on the citizenry from performing labor or holding their own money. With a whole nation organized like an army, in other words, as a socialist commonwealth, They were dependent upon second-class citizens and, dare I say, slaves for their resources. While they were skilled and hardy fighters, their model of social organization was not sustainable. Eventually, they were overcome by the innovation and technological advances found in the marketplaces of more trade-oriented and liberal Greek city-states. The second example is from, of course, the samurai. 260 years of being relatively closed off from the rest of the world left the Tokugawa military dictatorship ill-prepared to deal with the, quote, gunboat diplomacy, close quote, of America's black ships under Commodore Perry. Samurai combat had stagnated along with Japan's economy, and they ultimately proved no match for industrialized war. This is not in any way a critique of right or wrong. There is still quite a lot we can learn from these two great warrior traditions. It's simply a recognition of the importance logistics plays in the art of war. Logistics is one of the 6 elements identified in Igensho, the Book of Dignity, General Principles of Martial Art by Karasuma Kantaro. By the way, if you want an outline of this paradigm-shifting book, Igensho, a free PDF is available to you at www.everydaysamurai.life/dignity. That's www.everydaysamurai.life/dignity. And thankfully, we are joined once again by the author of Igensho, and for our purposes, we call him Jim. Jim, welcome back to Everyday Samurai.
Thanks for having me, Tim. Good to be here.
You state that if there is a single decisive element of government and of self-governance, it is logistics. Why do you say so?
Well, 2 things. One, to just kind of bridge the gap from your introduction, you speak of Sun Tzu's reference to the term law. And I think that while there's no mistake in your reference to the law of logistics, that this extends to the entire framework of martial art as the art of governance advocated or exposited in the Sun Tzu. If you look at the title, The Art of War, this is a mistranslation. Doesn't say the art of war. It says Hei-ho in Japanese, which is the law of arms. So in that sense, the law extends over the entire field, and this extends into the law of government and of governance. With respect to the way this segues into the subject of logistics, I think it's kind of convenient to refer to Napoleon's little comment that an army marches on its stomach. Logistics involves all of the goods and services of any major organization. Certainly, at this stage of history, the integration of civilian government with military establishments is the largest, most powerful, most complex, most extensive enterprise ever undertaken by humankind. It costs a lot of money. Economics is the basis of all government institutions. A government operates on the basis of the exchange, let's say the acquisition and the production and exchange of property. And the medium of that exchange is money. There are others, but that's the most common one. An economy must be very productive, very stable, and very strong in order to support a civilian government in time of peace, let alone a civilian or military government in time of war. People don't stop to consider, I think, very well what it costs to outfit and train and deploy one single military troop. I won't even begin to try to go into describing it. We can talk for an hour about it. The things that it takes to run a military establishment are not just weapon systems and arms of all descriptions and ammunition, but it takes millions of cardboard boxes and styrofoam cups, millions of buttons and zippers, millions of shoelaces. You can go on from there right up the food chain to intercontinental ballistic missiles and worldwide intelligence systems and fleets of ships and the whole thing. It is impossible to maintain and deploy any kind of a military establishment, or even in private life, to maintain and, when necessary, to deploy any kind of force option for defensive purposes without a logistical system, which involves all of the goods and services that an individual or a government or a military establishment employs in implementing its policies in service of its philosophic principles.
That's kind of what I wanted to get at in the chapter discussing these 6 elements and how they integrate policy, strategy, tactics, and skills. You've talked about it on the industrial scale and indicated that it also applies on the individual level. And you're getting at the idea that the logistics necessary to field a force in being, which we've talked about in the past, in pursuit of policy. How does that relate back to just the individual that's training in martial arts out there?
Well, unfortunately, I don't think it relates very much in practice to the way most people conceive of their martial arts training. But in order for them to truly understand the nature of what they're doing and aspire to reaching a high level of skill, which can be effective in helping them to govern their own life, I think it will be necessary for anyone engaged in any of these practices, whatever they are, ultimately to come to an understanding of the integration of all these 6 categories of philosophy, policy, logistics, strategy, tactics, and skills. It's necessary for a person to pay for instruction and equipment, to pay for transportation back and forth from the dojo, etc. All the little things that everybody's familiar with who undertakes to begin this kind of training in any formal sense. And go so far as to observe what their teachers are doing. The teachers are running businesses. Now, martial arts is generally not a great example of best practices in business, I think, just like any other business, but perhaps more so than in other sectors of the economy. Martial arts schools tend to go out of business within the first year or so due to undercapitalization. We won't go too far along those lines, but the only martial arts schools that tend to prosper and to flourish and to survive for long periods of time, and which do not have the benefits of government subsidies, are those which follow the demands of the market. And just now, the primary source of income for any martial arts business is the training of young people roughly from the ages of 4 to 14 years of age. And much of the content of instruction is really nothing to do with martial art at all. It's a means of entertaining and occupying children more or less constructively and safely in after-school programs and so forth when their parents are working. Well, I won't go on too much about that. The point is that economics is determining the whole direction of development in this industry, whereas the true nature of martial art, it can be done profitably at any level, certainly. By the time a person graduates from high school or college and has some awareness of what's going on in the world around him and has some way of correlating that with his own life experience, it becomes apparent that martial art is by no means reducible to fighting skill. Certainly one can say that in matters of governance, the very last and worst resort of any state is warfare, as Sun Tzu has indicated clearly in some of the quotations that you've mentioned. However, warfare, which can be studied and observed at many different levels and many elements of subtlety and complexity, does in fact, in my observation, break down ultimately to nothing more than what the average military troop these days refers to as killing people and breaking things. So there's a certain irony in the fact that death and destruction, the superior capability to deliver death and destruction upon an enemy, is the fundamental basis of all national policy in every country of the world, and is also the fundamental basis of all civilian governance. And therefore, it is also the fundamental basis of the individual's own practice of self-governance, even in countries at peace.
What strikes me as something very germane for us today, and as we talk about how Everyday Samurai is in defense of individual liberty and the security of a free state, and we go back to the underlying philosophy of the American Republic, it was intended that government would rely upon the people for its armed execution of force and the execution of law under the Constitution as a federated union. Therefore, we go back to how is it that communities can generate force and be that executive arm of law as a matter of policy. And that was how it was written into the Constitution. And we study the works of the pre-colonial militia statutes and the statutes that were automatically incorporated into the Constitution at the time of ratification. We're talking about a government that is dependent upon its citizenry to voluntary participation in the execution of law, but the generation of force was organic at the individual level, coming together in communities.
Indeed. In our country, I think that of course, there are many sources of our tradition, but in this respect, I think it goes back to the English common law system, going all the way back to the Middle Ages and perhaps stemming ultimately from Magna Carta, at a time when the logistics were extremely primitive, and it was not either affordable nor technically feasible for a central government such as the royal family of England to maintain a micromanagement capability of central governance across their entire country and their empire eventually. It was necessary for local customs, together with a few clearly understood elements of law, to govern local communities, usually by ways of juries led by justices of the peace. And that name, the name of that office, is extremely significant. Justices of the peace, justiciars, individuals whose capability and responsibility and whose job was to do justice and to keep the peace in the process. The way that the local communities, the people, participated in this process on a technical level was through convening juries to hear cases and make decisions. And the justices of the peace were able to issue legal directives, but it was in fact the militias which, under duress and spontaneous conditions, defended themselves and enforced the law. There was a tradition in Old England known as the Hue and Cry, whereby anyone who observed a crime in progress would do the equivalent of what we do today, which is calling 911. They would set up a hue and cry. Someone would holler, "Stop thief," or "Murder." And they would keep shouting until a whole bunch of other people came out and started shouting, and pretty soon everybody come out of their houses with their lances and their swords and their bows and arrows, and gave pursuit in order to arrest criminals and bring them before justices of the peace and convene juries and do justice.
Let me jump in a second to tell you about shop.everydaysamurai.life. If you're interested in personal security and readiness, you've probably got some tools that go into your everyday carry. Hopefully, this includes a tactical pen, because when you're legislatively or otherwise situationally unable to carry the best tools for the job, your last resort might just be a tactical pen. Having the right one could just be the deciding factor in a crisis. At shop.everydaysamurai.life, we've got an assortment of tactical pens ideally suited for strength and power when you need it most. A tactical pen means you've always got options. Plus, we're putting the finishing touches on a basic employment guide that will be yours as a bonus, absolutely free, when you purchase any EDC pen from our site. So check out shop.everydaysamurai.life today. Pick up a tactical pen, a first aid kit, or even some samurai-themed accessories. That's shop.everydaysamurai.life. I hearken back to, I want to clarify one thing. First off, the pre-colonial or the colonial time pre-constitutional statutes governing militia were different from state to state and jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And for the most part, they were not voluntary. In fact, they were mandatory. It was part of the civic duty to participate and to be ready at a moment's notice to answer the hue and cry, as you indicated. But I wanted to tie that back because it was an organic function of the people themselves policing their own territories, their own homes, their own neighborhoods, etc., and then participating in the larger federation construct, whether it be at the state or at the federal level. But it also goes back to the origin of the samurai, because it was the central court. Yes, it had moved around from Nara to Heian, a number of different locations in between, finally being settled there in Heian. But the actual administration of justice and the carrying out into execution of law was done by private warriors. It was done under sanction of the court, but it was carried out by private actors in the provinces at the magistrate and the local levels with a license, but through the resources of those people organically in their homes and in their own alliances that they had formed with their neighbors and people that they trusted. And therefore, the samurai house became a quasi-corporate entity. It wasn't necessarily about bloodlines. It was about intermarriage and things along those lines. But there was a certain private nature, and I go back to Carl Friday, Hired Swords, as well as William Wayne Ferris's Heavenly Warriors, to talk about the evolution of the samurai as being a private organization of warriors that were licensed by the central court.
Yes, this actually, you go back another step and see that originally armed public officials came from the kuge, which was the spiritual or religious aristocracy headed up by the emperors. They fielded police forces who were armed with swords, etc. And eventually they were not equal to the job as the populations expanded and various economic and political relationships became more complex. And they began to hire on people to help out with this business, which is the origin of the buke, the samurai families. And those were fundamentally provided through the offices of wealthy landowners and communities of farmers that were associated with those landowners. And before there was such a thing as a samurai class, the kinds of services and people that you're describing were referred to as Kokujin. And these people undertook a fundamentally militia-oriented kind of self-governance and law enforcement under the aegis of the imperial houses in Kyoto, and eventually began to develop a culture of their own and to codify, in essence, their own laws. And eventually these two forces came into conflict, which we won't go into just now. That's a whole other subject. But they started out operating cooperatively in order to keep the peace and to enforce the law. I would like to just go back for a moment to England and say, as we come forward in time, that there was the English Civil War in the 1660s and 70s and so on, after which point I believe it was it Charles I or Charles II who was beheaded by Cromwell, and all that stuff ultimately led to the English Bill of Rights of 1689, in which there was a provision to mollify the Protestant population, because Charles was a Catholic king and the Civil War had a good deal to do with the bigotry of Catholic government toward the Protestant population of England. And one of the chief problems was that the Catholic government insisted on disarming the Protestant population, which they feared because of their injustices against it. So after the long years of warfare and social dissolution, they finally arrived at the English Bill of Rights of 1689, which had within it a clause permitting Protestants the possession and the use of arms for their defense. And this is the origin of our Second Amendment.
I'm relating back to how it was the court that would give a special license to a tsuibushi, or an arrest and capture order, or an investigator to go out with the court's endorsement of raising troops. They wouldn't receive any pay until afterwards, but they would certainly get rewards once they were complete. So again, it was the economic base of private landholders that were able to raise the forces necessary to go forth and conduct a capture or to suppress an insurrection or what have you. And we see this carried forward in English law, and then enshrined in the U.S. Constitution is the letter of marque and reprisal. And we can dispense with these big, dumb, bureaucratic, industrial militaries that are such a drain on national resources if we reinvestigate the potential for these types of marque and reprisal type licenses for private actors to economize their resources and actually go forth without expending the nation's treasury?
Well, I think that's a very interesting hypothesis, and possibly a means could be found to effect this kind of thing, but I would very much like to think that it was possible to do that, but I'm not sanguine about it at this point. It's going to take a lot of studying, and there is a good deal of study underway at the Cato Institute, for example, and elsewhere. However, all of this gets back to your original question, which is how does economics and politics and government and martial art integrate? And I think what we've just gone over demonstrates exactly how that works.
Then let me bring it back to one of the things that you put in the book, which really piqued my interest the first time I read it, and certainly caused me to buy the book a second time and read it again, because you talk about economic principle being the foundation of political philosophy. Is it possible for politics or political organizations, more specifically, to be ordered by economic principles? And if so, how?
Well, that's a very large question. Politics needs to be defined. It's quite different than policy. Policy, I think we mentioned at some point, is a matter of defining what you want and what you don't want, and what you're willing to do to get what you want and what you're not willing to do, what sorts of sacrifices or injuries you're willing to accept or inflict in the process of getting what you want. And that what it is you want and the way that you go about getting it or maintaining it or defending it has to be based on a coherent philosophic foundation. So there we have philosophy and policy, a kind of continuum between them. But politics is quite different than policy. I would define politics as the acquisition, cultivation, administration, and deployment of power. Now, we all know the famous axiom of John Dahlberg, Baron Acton, who said, "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." I think we can see the truth of this throughout history and current events. Politics is a matter of power, and therefore it is extremely dangerous to everyone concerned, not only the governed, but the governors themselves. And the political system devised by the founders of the United States had as one of its primary aims the restraint of people in power and the curbing of any trends or tendencies or capabilities to achieve absolute power. In order to understand the nature of governance, I think we have to return to the fundamental issue of philosophy in our country, which is individual rights. We begin with the right to life, the origin of all other rights, and inherent in the right to life is the right to private property, which is indispensable to life itself, to maintaining and defending life, and to achieving what any particular individual or community may think of as a good life.
Friends, if you are at all interested in Japan, the samurai, or Japanese martial arts of any kind, it is essential that you learn at least the basics of the language. That's right, you must study Japanese to have credibility in samurai-related martial arts. At least set a personal goal to learn the proper pronunciation for the terms in your art. Learn to say the names of the techniques correctly and be able to interact a little with the Japanese people you'll inevitably run into. Right now, there's no excuse, because when you sign up through my special link, you'll get a free 14-day trial to Rocket Languages. Just go to everydaysamurai.life/rocket to access interactive audio, culture notes, voice recognition technology to check your pronunciation, writing lessons so you can read the road signs or find a ramen shop when you need one. We're talking about 128 hours of lesson time and a downloadable app to take it all on the go with you. You can learn Japanese on your commute. It's never been easier. All this free for 2 full weeks when you go to www.everydaysamurai.life/rocket. That's everydaysamurai.life/rocket.
Therefore, the first article of private property underlying all others is the life itself of the individual human being. And that would be perhaps capable of being broken down into 2 parts. There is the physical self, physical body of the human being, and there is the metaphysical self, which is the immaterial existence of that human being in the human mind, which is something breaking down into perceptions and emotions and intellect and everything that comes from the interaction of those factors. So the right to life and the right to private property are mutually inherent, and governance and politics has largely been throughout history around the world a matter of aggression, which is the deliberate denial of individual rights to human beings by means of deception and force. This has been largely the model of government that we have seen in most parts of the world. We still even have significant elements of that in our own country today, despite the fact that the founders attempted to devise a form of government so inefficient that no tyrant could ever make it work.
So how does that tie back to economics?
Economics is the means by which the individual, private human being can fund all of the fundamental requirements of his or her own life and liberty. Without property, beginning with the fundamental element of property, which is one's own life, one's own body and mind and conscience, there is nothing. We need food and water and clothing and shelter and everything else that comes beyond that in order to preserve and protect and defend life and to facilitate the flourishing of life beyond mere survival. That requires a socio-economic, political, legal order, which Friedrich Hayek referred to as the spontaneous order of human collaboration. This arises or gives rise to the theory of free market economics or capitalism.
And that reminds me of what you wrote here in Chapter 1 about economic and philosophic principles that have socio-political values such as capitalism, individualism, and scientific method. And this is in the same paragraph where you talk about the essential nature of understanding economics as part of martial arts study and how all of this is essential to logistics as a means of integrating policy. So again, we're tying it back to these types of elements involved not only in martial art, but as a means of effectuating self-government.
Exactly. And that would refer to self-government by nations and communities and families and relationships, private relationships between people such as marriages. And finally, at the most basic level, self-governance by the private individual, which refers to the application of philosophic principle by means of policy and logistics, and later, perhaps when necessary, through strategy, tactics, and skills, which may not always be matters of violence. These may be matters of business. They may be matters of politics. They may be matters of social relationships, international relations, a whole range of different things. But the problem that arises always, inevitably, in governance is that aggression is a universal, fundamental, perennial component of human nature. If the entire world, the whole population of the world, were finally to agree on a few fundamental principles of self-governance, which would bring peace and prosperity to the whole population of the world. Let's just break it down for convenience to the precursor of the Golden Rule, which was advocated by the Rabbi Hillel in Persia, who said, "What is hateful to thyself, do not to thy fellow. That is the law entire. All else is mere commentary." If the whole world were to abide by that principle, and only one man were to repudiate that principle and resort to aggression, he would be able to kill or intimidate all the people around him and to persuade by the threat of force a small group of people to assist him in his aggression. And gradually, perhaps an entire nation would be developed which based its economic activities on the use of deception and force. This is a perfect example of this is the way the Nazis came to power in Germany in the 1930s, or how the Soviets came to power in 1917 through roughly 1925 after the internal civil war in the Soviet Union, in Russia, and subsequently became the Soviet Union. And you can go on and on, go all the way back or forward through history and see this happening. So Therefore, martial art as the forcible mechanism of civilian governance is always and everywhere necessary and unavoidable.
That's right, because if men were angels, no government would be necessary at all.
Exactly.
There needs to be some means by which people can repel violations of the non-aggression principle or violations to their property, and organizing for the defense of themselves and their property is what government is all about when it comes to the tale of which we are currently experiencing, that Enlightenment philosophy that is a republic that is based upon free government or self-government, and one that was designed to have an armed equilibrium, meaning that no political entity would ever have too much power or a monopoly on the use of force, because everyone had that right and means to the tools of force. And in fact, the Union was based on relying upon the population for executing the laws.
Yeah, and this is the essence of the American political philosophy.
But it requires resources in order to bring that philosophy into effect. And when it comes to applying the martial art in the real world, it means beans and bullets and bodies to be in a certain place in a certain location, which means that we have to have logistics. So it's essential for the individual just as much as the community, just as much as the nation, to understand that it is all about resources, that conflict is all about control of resources, and that you have to use resources in order to mount an effective defense.
Indeed, and the original seminal resource is the individual human being who is able to develop external material resources for whatever use seems most important at any given time and place. So if we're talking about the fundamental property which is possessed by every living human being, it is the body and the mind of that individual human being, which means that the rights of the rich and the poor and the middle classes, the rights of all persons, and I would say all human beings, because I would define persons as differently from human beings. Persons being those human beings who are capable of taking responsibility. We have human beings who are newborn infants, who are very elderly people or ill people in comas or whatever, who are not capable of taking responsibility for their own lives and defense and so on. And those people have all the negative rights that we recognize, whereas a child in reaching maturity begins to be granted the practice of positive rights because the child has demonstrated an ability to be self-responsible. So an infant or a 100-year-old codger in a wheelchair is not going to be able to produce income and wealth nor deploy the means of defense. And we who are able to do these things take responsibility for those people who cannot. Therefore, we're basing our laws and our values and our social customs on the idea that every human being, no matter what description, has the same equal, identical individual rights. And that because a threat to the rights of any individual is a threat to the rights of all persons, and because the selective suppression of any one right is a threat to the existence of all rights, we are forced to take responsibility to defend these rights when necessary by force.
So in closing, I think that one of the most important passages to discuss logistics in your book is summing up in that logistics is the aggregate of resources and equipment you will use to realize your own policy in concrete form. And it includes everything from your business, your job, your credit, your domicile, your home, your office, your hotel room, etc., legal advisors, everything that comes with civil service systems, education, debtors, creditors, clothing, food, everything you use, both abstract and concrete in terms of resources. What do you mean by abstract?
Services, perhaps, would be the best way to abbreviate it. Legal services, legal representation, national defense, personal defense, concepts which are manifest physically through deliberate action, or the sorts of things that are indeed manifest as physical material, but which we are largely unaware of unless we stop to think about it, such as the availability of air and water and shelter and so on. But if one is thinking clearly about this, these are all material goods, but the ultimate abstract good is justice. It is the aggregation of our rights and our ability to, through a social contract, recognize the equal and identical rights of all human beings and to behave accordingly. So that perhaps the easiest way of abbreviating all this is simply to say that the good life consists in the power to assign value and to pursue it at liberty without recourse to aggression. When Jefferson spoke of the pursuit of happiness, this, I believe, is what he was talking about. No two people will find their happiness exactly in the same way, and there are people whose happiness will depend on the doing of evil, the violation of other people's rights. So, in order to achieve the good, we must first abstain from aggression, and when we encounter people who do not abstain from aggression, we are compelled by a sense of justice, and we're compelled to defend our own rights and the rights of other people. Anytime we defend our own rights, whether it's in court or on the field of battle or in the street, whether by means of reason or by resort to force, we are defending the rights of all human beings. We cannot logistically take responsibility for the defense of millions and millions, billions of people around the world, of whose situations we know nothing. But every time we oppose aggression, whether by means of reason or by force, we are defending the rights of all human beings everywhere.
And with that, I would just like to tie this back to economics, because I think it harkens to Julian Simon's book, The Ultimate Resource, which posits that the human mind and its creativity and ingenuity really is the source of every other developed resources in the material world.
Exactly.
With that, I want to thank you for your time, Jim.
Thank you, sir.
Look forward to the next time. Friends, we hope you've enjoyed this episode of Everyday Samurai and look forward to seeing you next time. Be sure to subscribe to our feed to stay up to date with our latest offerings. If you like what you've heard here, give us a thumbs up or a 5-star review. Share it with a friend or someone you think would benefit from this message. Remember, the free PDF outline of Egen's show, The Book of Dignity, is available. Our compliments to you at everydaysamurai.life/dignity. Until next time, stay sharp, stay aware, and be well.